Hello YouTube and welcome back to another Dare to Game video. Today we're playing Mount and Blade Bannerlord and we're doing another Strengths and Weaknesses video. Today we're going to focus on the Sturgian the Principality of Sturgia. Sturgian Principality, whatever it is. It's this whole northern area up here. So definitely, probably, I think out of the dozen or so playthroughs that I've done in this game, you know, full playthroughs, I think the one I did as a full Sturgian roleplay was probably the most fun. And so if you're wondering in this series of videos, because you probably watched some of them before, maybe you haven't, I don't know, why I focus on this, because a lot of people will say, well, the strengths and weaknesses and the differences in the factions don't matter. A, because you can use whatever armor you want and you can recruit whatever troops you want, and it doesn't matter anyway because the troops are fine, the player always wins. A couple things there. A, I recommend doing role-played playthroughs. I think they're way more fun. Start as a faction, only use that faction's armor, only marry people from that faction, only recruit travelers or wanderers from that faction, and only use that faction's troops. It makes a way more immersive and fun playthrough, in my opinion, and it makes you play the game with a lot more variety, which is obviously the whole point of a sandbox game. And number two is, if your opinion is it doesn't make a difference anyway because the player always wins, you have a serious advantage. Yes, you do have an advantage because you're a person and you're playing against AI, but I recommend turning the difficulty up. On max difficulty, the game is actually a challenge, and it's a lot more fun that way, in my opinion. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get to talking about what Sturgia's strengths and weaknesses are. So before we get into that, let's read this. So it says, Sturgia, the confederation of small kingdoms that is now the Principality of Sturgia, came into being only a century ago. As boomtowns sprung up alongside the bays and lakes of the north, the local tribal leaders forged marriage pacts with Nords and other adventurers, hiring their swords to subdue their neighbors. Under pressure from the empire, they elected a prince to lead them in war. And eventually, the princes became a hereditary office, but the idea of monarchy has never sat easily with the independence-minded boyars, and the potential for rebellion always lurks under the surface of Sturgian politics. The obvious Viking/Norse comparisons are there to be made with these Sturgians, but I think armor-wise they look more like the Kievan Rus, and they're kind of a combination of those cultures. So, a very fun historical basis for this group. But now let's just start it off with the troop strengths for the Principality of Sturgia. So, starting us off, we'll focus on heavy infantry, and the Sturgian people have the two best heavy infantry in the game. And so basically my definition of heavy infantry is going to be any infantry troop with heavy armor and that uses a one-handed weapon and a shield. So yes, you're going to have what some people may consider heavy infantry as your two-handed ones, like people using a big axe. That's not what I consider to be heavy infantry. But anyway, so the two best heavy infantry in the game are the Sturgian Heavy Axemen and the Sturgian Heavy Spearmen. They're unbelievably good on the field. They just dominate infantry to infantry. Sturgians outclass all, even the Imperial Legionaries, which are the next best. So the number 1 and 2 best overall, in my opinion, are the Sturgian Heavy Axemen, which are the best. And then the Spearmen, which are super good too. Stats are really similar, armor's really similar. The only difference is instead of the axe being the main weapon, like the Axemen are, which is excellent, they have a spear. So I like to do a mix of, like, for my infantry in Sturgia, I'll do like 75% Heavy Axemen and 25% Spearmen, or like 70% Heavy Axemen, 20% Spearmen, and then 10% Heroic Linebreakers, but we'll get into that later. But yeah, as far as stats go on these, for the Axemen, we've got one-handed of 130, athletics of 130, and throwing of 130, which makes them super good with those throwing axes. And obviously the heavy armor, the huge shield, and a nice powerful axe with a high one-handed skill makes them way better than pretty much every other infantry in the game. So for stats on the Spearmen, you can see we have 140 for the polearm, 140 for one-handed, and an athletics of 125. So very mobile troops, despite their heavy armor and giant shield. But these ones are obviously the counter to cavalry. So as good as the Axemen are, I like having Spearmen there to defend against cavalry. But with that in mind, the first strength, obviously, is infantry. Best heavy infantry in the game. The next strength I'll talk about is their heavy shock cavalry, which is the Sturgian Druznik Champion, which is the top of their noble train. Their noble troop tree, which starts with the Sturgian Otrok. But yeah, the Druznik Champion is on par with Azurai and Khuzate Lancers. So it's not as good as the Imperial Heavy Cavalry or the Vlandian Heavy Cavalry, but it comes pretty close to being the same level as like the Khuzait heavy lancers, and the Azurai Mamluk melee cavalry. So it is pretty effective. It definitely outclasses anything the Battanians can field, and I like them. They've got a nice solid spear. They obviously have a huge shield. Their stats are pretty solid. They've got riding of 170, which is actually pretty high. Pole arms of 170, which is also nice and high. One-handed of 200, and athletics of 140. So unlike most cavalry troops, these ones are good on their feet. So I like the Druzhnik champions because you can use them very, very effectively as a heavy shot cavalry, but also you can use them very effectively in a siege or in a defense, or if they get dismounted, they just make a really good infantry troop. That's a serious advantage as well. They have a pretty good shot cavalry that's well balanced, well armored, and also works as infantry. The other general benefit to their troops is that most of them use axes for their one-handed and two-handed weapons. So you can see our heroic line breakers also use a giant axe. The only exception to that being the ones that have spears, and they'll use those. Axes are the best weapons in the game against shields. By far. And they're also really good for taking down doors and stuff, so that's useful in a siege. But whereas a lot of your other heavy infantry, like your Vlandian sergeants or your Imperial legionaries, they'll use swords. Swords are totally ineffectual against the big shields that the Sturgians use, whereas axes are not ineffectual against the shields that the other infantry use. So there's a reason why their infantry is as good as it is, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that they primarily use axes. And then finally, they have mounted skirmishers, so they're not the best in the game, but considering they don't have a mounted archer, it's good that they have some sort of a skirmishing troop. And the Sturgian horse raiders are not a bad troop overall. They just can get outclassed by all other mounted archers. They're pretty useful against cavalry, I would say, as long as it's not mounted archers, like regular shot cavalry. The Sturgian horse raiders are pretty good at foiling them. They do have a polearm, which makes them effective as lancers if you want to use them that way, but it's their large bag of javelins that I like using them for. They've got a fast horse, but it doesn't have good armor on it, so it can be taken out. Their athletics is only 80, but they're still usable on foot because they've got heavy armor, a big shield, and an axe as their primary one-handed weapon. I still consider the horse raiders to be a strength, even though as far as mounted archers and skirmishers go, they're pretty low on the tier 5 list. We'll still count it as a strength though, because they are still very useful. But for weaknesses, the main one is what we just touched on. They don't have a mounted archer. So much like Vlandia and the Battanians, they don't have a mounted archer. So if you're playing against the Khuzaits, Imperials, and the Azurai, you're going to have to realize that you don't have a mobile archer to foil theirs, so you're going to have to use something else. So it is a serious weakness that they don't have a mounted archer. The other major weakness of the Sturgian army is their bowmen. So the Sturgian veteran bowmen are the 5th overall for tier 5 bowmen in the game, so they're beat by all the other major factions. Not great in that regard. So their weaknesses come from a couple things. Their stats aren't terrible, so they've got a bow stat of 140, one-handed of 120, and athletics of 130, but they have pretty light armor that doesn't offer great protection with a great big open-faced helmet. Their bow is not very strong, so even though their bow skill is nice and high, the bow they use is not that good of a bow. So even though they have 2 quivers of arrows, they just don't get that many kills. They're still useful, especially for like defending castles and stuff, but they're a pretty weak bowman, and it's definitely a weakness of the army as a whole. And the other major troop weakness that I don't like about the Sturgians is the inconsistent troop progression. So the XP requirements between the high tiers is much higher than most other in-class troops for other factions. So you won't see a real steady progression, and you'll have like a good mix of all the tiers. You're going to find you're going to have the least amount of high tiers unless you focus really, really specifically on skilling them up. As far as general strengths for the Sturgian people as a whole, so the starting faction itself, there is only one border because they are the far north. So they have this southern border. A lot of that is taken up by this lake. So they've got this one border here, which kind of follows the rivers down here. And then this other border over here, which touches on the Northern Empire a little bit, and then the Khuzaits over here. So it's nice that you don't have to worry about invasions coming in from the north or like the northeast or the northwest. It's really just the south. So that's nice. It's easier to track troop movements that way. And another strength that I would put them under is that they do have a medium economy. It's not the strongest in the game, but it's definitely not the weakest either. They are the main producers of 4 different resources: fur, flax, cattle, and fish, which makes them a pretty good option for trading. trading. The only option that is stronger for trading, in my opinion, is the Aserai, but this allows you to make really effective and profitable trading runs into the Aserai territory. So you stock up at Revil, Varcheg, Omar, Balgard, Varnavapul, Sabir, and Tial, which they start out with quite a few cities, which is nice. You stock up on your fur, flax, cattle, and fish at low prices up here, and you bring all of them down into the Aserai territory, and you sell them for a huge profit down there. Then down there you buy luxury resources like silk and dates and stuff like that, and you bring them back up to Sturgia and sell them for a profit. So the whole trade mission for me when I'm playing as either the Aserai or Sturgia is just running back and forth between those two different areas. So it is an advantage playing as a Sturgian that you can very effectively become a trader. As far as general weaknesses, although there's only one border, it is a very long and stretched out kingdom. So you have your farthest west settlement over here is Ustakol, which is about as far south as far west as Karbanzeth, a little bit more in fact, and then your farthest east is all the way over here at I think it's right here on Urikskala Castle and Bukitz. It is a really long distance from there to there, so when you're fighting, especially on multiple fronts, it can be a bit tricky to move troops in a logistically effective way. So that is a weakness in my opinion, that because of how long and stretched out the kingdom is. And then again, the other weakness is a lack of horses in the Sturgian area. So if you want to do a cavalry heavy army, you're probably going to be sending trips down into the Empire or into the Kuzite territory to buy horses so you can actually upgrade your troops, because the Sturgians just don't have a lot of horses in this area. And also luxury resources. Like I said, the way that I like to do that is to buy my luxury resources down in Aserai with the profits from the Sturgian regular resources, and then just trade back and forth that way. But Sturgia itself has basically no luxury resources, so you can't start the high profit trading missions here. So those are your general weaknesses. So not that many strengths and weaknesses to talk about for the Sturgians, but the ones that exist are important. For our combat strategy with the Sturgians, first of all, the army makeup that I like to do with these guys is about 50% infantry, so I like to focus heavily on the infantry, and then 30% shot cavalry, so primarily coming from your noble troop tree, and 20% mounted skirmishers. I avoid the archers. If I do the archers, I just put them in the castles and cities. I let them to defend in there. I don't use them for my on-the-field army, either in open fields, assault. I don't use them. So what I do use, like I said, 50% infantry, and of your 50% infantry, most of that is going to be your heavy axemen, because they're just dominating. But I'll put enough heavy spearmen in there to make them more effective against cavalry, and then I'll have some heroic line breakers, because those are really good at busting up enemy infantry formations, so your axemen can do even more damage. So that's the makeup I do. As far as the actual strategy, I will use my heavy axemen and spearmen, and I'll form a shield wall with them, and I'll just have them slowly advance into the battlefield. The Sturgian shield wall is basically impenetrable. It's a little weak on the flanks, but because the troops are individually strong, the flanks are really hard to turn on a Sturgian shield wall. Then with that slowly advancing heavy infantry line, I'll have then I'll just keep performing a hammer and anvil maneuver, using them as the anvil and my shot cavalry as the hammer. So you have this slowly advancing impenetrable infantry line, and as soon as they make contact with the enemy, you let them kind of lock in, and it comes to a stalemate pretty quick. So what you do is you get your heavy infantry line to engage, and then you use your shot cavalry, which you have over in reserve, and you smash them into the enemy from behind. It's super effective. I've taken out armies, up to 10 times the size of what I'm using when I do it that way. You have your heavy infantry line with the Sturgians, and then you come in from behind with the Druzniks, which are a pretty dang powerful shot cavalry, and you smash the enemy troops in the rear, and it annihilates them wave after wave after wave. So I'll just keep doing that hammer and anvil. As soon as the shot cavalry have come to a halt, I'll pull them back, reform them, charge them in, and hammer on the enemy again. The only other thing that'll vary that a little bit is those 20% mounted skirmishers that I like to use. I'll send those in waves. Basically, if I see an enemy cavalry charge coming, I'll send the skirmishers in, and they'll quickly take out a whole bunch of them with their javelins, and then I'll have my skirmishers retreat back, and I'll just use them in reserve to do that. Because the only weakness of the Sturgian line, especially if you don't have enough spearmen, is that a heavy enough shot cavalry charge from Imperial Cataphracts or Vlandian Knights can break through the line decently effectively, and then it'll screw up your plan. So I use the skirmishers to basically just screw up the enemy cavalry charge. Other than that, for defense, the best ones on defense are going to be your axemen and your archers for defending your castles, and your best ones for offense, your heroic line breakers are really good on offense, your axemen, spearmen, those are all really good on offense, and if you have a huge surplus of your Druzhnik warriors, they make a good enough infantry troop that you don't lose that many on the field. So that's the general strategy, and that is all for strengths and weaknesses for the Principality of Sturgia. Hope you enjoyed this video, hope you found it useful, but that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching another Dare to Game video. If you liked this video, please leave a like and a comment. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you like my content and would like to support this channel, consider becoming a member today for as little as $1.99 a month. It makes a huge difference. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day. I'll see you next time.